Only you can save my bloodline, human, the alien queen whispered. I was speechless. The Royal Corvette had already docked before anyone told me it was coming. I was in the middle of tagging a retroviral sequence on my second screen, when my cabin door opened without a knock, and 3 Velhari royal guards filled the frame like a wall of chitinous armor and cold bioluminescent eyes. They were each nearly 8 feet tall. Their 6 limbs moved with a stillness that felt more threatening than motion. Behind me, my reconstituted noodles were going cold on the desk. I looked at the guards. I looked at the noodles. Neither situation seemed to be improving. My name is Calvin Marsh. I am a xenobiologist and genetic liaison officer aboard the Confederacy science vessel Aurelian. I have no military training, no diplomatic ranking, and no particular physical courage. I catalog alien DNA sequences for a living. I have done this for 9 years, without anyone outside my field knowing my name. Apparently, someone did. The guards did not speak. One of them extended a data card toward me, with the kind of precision that made it clear refusal was not on the menu. I took the card. It carried a royal seal I recognized immediately, because it appeared in every xenopolitical briefing as a symbol of the oldest sovereign line in the Confederacy. The Velhari sovereignty. 11,000 years of unbroken royal lineage. A civilization that had been mapping stars when my ancestors were still debating fire. The message on the card said only, "Come now." I went. The Royal Corvette was connected to the Aurelian through a docking collar, and the transition from our corridor to theirs was like walking from a utility closet into a cathedral. The Velhari built for scale. Their ceilings were 40 feet high. Their walls were alive with slow bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like breathing. The air smelled like copper, and something warm that had no human equivalent. Commander Leith Four Winds met me at the junction. He was one of the gaseous form species, contained in a bilateral pressure suit, and he was already agitated in the way that looked like his containment field flickering at the edges. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I want you to understand that whatever is happening here, I have filed 3 formal objections and expect this to be resolved through proper channels before any conversation of substance takes place." "Good morning to you too, Commander," I said. "This is extremely irregular." "I noticed. You are not a diplomat. I'm aware." He followed me down the corridor anyway, because whatever authority he thought he had, it had clearly already been bypassed by someone with considerably more of it. The audience chamber was at the center of the Corvette. The guards stopped at the threshold. Leith Four Winds attempted to follow me inside, and was stopped by a single raised limb from the figure seated at the far end of the room. Queen Sisvara, of the Velhari sovereignty, filled the chamber, the way a storm fills a valley. She was not merely large, she was composed. Every one of her 6 limbs was positioned with a deliberateness that communicated absolute, unhurried authority. Her bioluminescence moved in slow patterns across her thorax and upper limbs, deep indigo shading to silver, and her compound eyes caught the light in a way that made it impossible to tell what she was looking at. She was looking at me. The doors closed behind me. The commander's muffled protest lasted about 4 seconds before he apparently thought better of it. Sisvara studied me for a long moment. I did not speak. 9 years of working with alien species had taught me that silence is almost never the wrong choice in a first encounter. When she spoke, her standard was perfect and very quiet. The kind of quiet that is only possible for someone who has never needed to raise their voice to be heard. "Only you can save my bloodline, human," she said. "I was told you would understand." I looked at her for a moment. "Who told you that?" I asked. "Your own genetic record," she said. "I read it myself." I stood there in the chamber of an 11,000-year-old royal line, in front of a queen who could have ended my career or my existence with equal ease, and all I could think was that I had left my noodles completely unattended. She gestured to a secondary chamber to her left. "Come, my geneticist will show you the data." Dr. Yenna Foch was already in the room when we entered, and she made it clear within the first 30 seconds that she did not want me there. She was a senior royal geneticist, smaller than the queen but carrying herself with the compressed authority of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in every room. She stood beside a display wall covered in genetic maps and looked at me the way a master craftsman looks at someone who has wandered into their workshop and picked up a tool. The human can observe, she said to the queen. He will not understand most of what he sees. Show him everything, Sisvara said, and left the room. Yenna turned to the display wall and began speaking in the rapid, clipped cadence of someone summarizing a decade of failure for an audience they expect to lose within 3 minutes. The Velhari genome, 11,000 years of genetic records. A royal bloodline maintained with such precision that it had become a point of cultural pride, a symbol of continuity, of preservation. And it was dying, not from disease, not from war. The reproductive viability of the royal line had collapsed over the last 4 generations, to the point of near extinction, clutch after clutch of eggs failing, immune responses degrading. Every specialist the Confederacy had sent had looked at the data and reached the same conclusion. The genome was too old, too preserved, too perfect. It had sustained itself so precisely for so long that it had lost the biological capacity to adapt. Yenna finished her summary and crossed her arms in a way that, across species lines, communicated the same thing universally. Your turn, and I expect nothing. I asked to see the raw genome maps. She refused. I asked again, and this time I specified the sequences I wanted by their Velhari cataloging notation. 3 specific chromosomal designations from a paper I had read 3 years ago, in a journal that had approximately 40 readers in the entire Confederacy. I cited the paper by author and publication cycle. Yenna went very still. Show him everything, I said quietly, repeating the Queen's words back to her. She already said so. She showed me everything. I read for 6 hours. The room was silent. At some point a guard brought water, and I drank it without looking away from the display. Yenna sat in the corner and watched me with an expression that shifted, very slowly, from contempt to something more cautious. The genome was extraordinary. Every sequence was pristine, maintained, cross-referenced across generations, with a rigor that would have made any human genetic institution weep with envy. It was a perfect archive. That was the problem. A genome that has never been stressed does not develop the capacity to manage stress. I sat back in my chair. I had not realized I had been leaning forward for the past 3 hours. My back made a series of opinions known. Your genome is not dying, I said. It is waiting. You have been treating this like a disease. It is not a disease. It is a lock, and the mechanism to open it has been dormant so long that everyone assumed it was gone. Yenna stared at me. Every specialist we brought concluded the adaptive sequences were vestigial. Every specialist you brought was looking for what they expected to find, I said. I spent 9 years cataloging genetic sequences that no one else thought were worth cataloging. I have read more so-called junk DNA than anyone in the Confederacy, because I find it interesting, and it kept being interesting the more I read. I pulled up the sequence I had found in the 3rd hour of reading. A dormant cluster, buried deep in the 4th chromosomal arrangement, that bore a structural resemblance to something I had cataloged 2 years ago from a completely different source. A human plague response gene cluster. From the 2089 outbreak on the Kepler colony. A disaster that had killed 60% of the colony population and left the survivors with immune systems so aggressively rebuilt that their descendants 3 generations later were still showing adaptive benefits. It should not have matched anything in Velhari biology. It matched perfectly. This cluster, I said, pointing. This is not vestigial. It has been inactive for so long that every analysis tool you ran concluded it was non-functional. But the structure is intact. The mechanism is intact. Someone, somewhere in your evolutionary history, built a door. You have simply never had a reason to open it. Yenna was on her feet before I finished the sentence. She moved to the display with a speed that startled me and began pulling secondary maps that confirmed the structural integrity of the sequence from 4 different archival periods. Her mandibles clicked in a rapid pattern I did not know. Whatever it meant, it was loud. Queen Sisvara returned to the room sometime in the next 10 minutes. I am not certain exactly when, because I was focused on the display wall, and Yenna had stopped objecting to my presence entirely, and was now working alongside me with the focused intensity of someone who has been searching for something for a very long time, and can suddenly smell it. What the Velhari genome needed was not outside genetic material. It was not intervention, or replacement, or compromise of their ancient bloodline. It needed a signal, a synthetic activator, built using the architecture of human retroviral sequences as a template, that would reach the dormant cluster and remind it that it was still needed. Humans, I explained to Yenna while we worked, are not a particularly impressive species on the surface. We are not the strongest, the longest-lived, the most intelligent, or the most stable. What we are is the most catastrophically, repeatedly nearly destroyed species in the Confederacy, and we have the genetic receipts to prove every single time. The Toba catastrophe reduced us to perhaps 10,000 individuals 70,000 years ago. The plagues, the famines, the collapses. Each one wrote something into our genome. Each near extinction left behind a solution encoded into the survivors, passed forward in time in sequences that most species called junk and we called history. I was not remarkable. I had just spent 9 years reading that history very carefully because I found it interesting, and now I was sitting next to a Velhari royal geneticist at 2 in the morning, reading her civilization's equivalent of the same thing. We built the activator over 4 days. Yenna checked my sequencing 3 times and found 1 genuine error in the second cycle, which I corrected. I found 2 errors in her verification model, which she corrected without comment, but with a slight tilt of her head that I was beginning to read as acknowledgement. On the 5th day she found no errors. I found none of hers. We submitted the activator for biological synthesis together. Neither of us said anything about that. It simply happened that way. The first treatment cycle took 11 days. I spent most of that time in a small guest chamber aboard the Corvette, sleeping more than I had in years, and eating the closest approximation to human food that the Velhari galley could produce. It was not good food. I ate all of it. On the 12th day, Yenna came to my chamber door. She did not speak immediately. She stood in the doorway with the stillness that I had learned, over the previous 2 weeks, meant she was managing something large. 74% viability, she said finally. I understood what that meant. Their previous record, in the last decade, had been 6%. She stood in my doorway for 4 minutes, without moving or speaking. I did not ask her if she was all right. I understood, by then, that she needed the 4 minutes, and that asking would interrupt something important. Velhari did not cry. What they did instead was go very still and let the internal processing complete before they returned to function. I made her tea from a packet I had brought from my cabin on the Aurelian. It was human tea, chamomile, and something dried, and she almost certainly found the smell strange. She held the cup anyway. The Queen sent for me the next morning. The audience chamber felt different from the first time I had stood in it. The bioluminescence that moved across Asvara's thorax and limbs was brighter now. Not dramatically so. Not the difference between darkness and light. The difference between a fire that has been carefully tended and one that has been left to manage on its own. She waited until the guards had stepped back to the far wall before she spoke. "You are preparing to return to your vessel," she said. "My work here is done," I said. "Yenna has everything she needs for the continuation cycles. She understands the mechanism better than I do at this point, which is how it should be." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not empty. "Why did you help us?" she asked. The question surprised me, which she must have noticed. "It was an interesting problem," I said. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I began to wonder if I had answered incorrectly. "Every specialist we brought," she said slowly, "came here to demonstrate their expertise, to solve a problem they could take credit for solving. They arrived with conclusions already forming and spent their time here confirming those conclusions." "That happens," I said. "You arrived with nothing. You read the data as though you had never heard of us, as though every sequence was new information." "It was new information," I said. "I had never read your genome before." "You did not come here to be remarkable," she said. "No. And yet." I did not have an answer for that, so I said nothing. She rose from her position with the slow, exact grace that I had stopped registering as alien somewhere around the 3rd day, and had started registering simply as her. She moved to the window at the far wall, where the stars outside were the same stars visible from my cabin on the Aurelian, just seen from a different angle. "What will you tell your people?" she asked. About what happened here. My colleagues will want to see the data, I said. With your permission, I would like to publish the mechanism. Not the royal genome, the mechanism. It has applications that go beyond the Velhari. There are 3 other species in the Confederacy with similar convergence patterns. She turned to look at me. Her mandibles moved in a pattern I recognized now as something between consideration and approval. You will have that permission, she said, on one condition. Name it. You will not describe yourself as the one who saved us, she said. In your publication, in any record of this. I was genuinely confused. I did not plan to. Good, she said, because it would be inaccurate. You did not save us. You paid attention to things that others had discarded. You kept records that no one asked you to keep. You found a connection that was only visible to someone who had spent 9 years reading what everyone else called noise. She paused. That is not heroism. That is something quieter and considerably more rare. I thought about my 9 years of cataloging retroviral sequences in a field that most of my colleagues found tedious. I thought about the late nights reading genome maps from species I had never met, in languages I was still learning, because the patterns were there, and patterns, once noticed, are very difficult to stop noticing. What will you tell the Confederacy? I asked, about why the project succeeded. The truth, she said, that we brought in a human who was not remarkable, who was simply paying attention when everyone else had stopped. She returned to her position. The audience was over, and I knew it the same way I had known it the first time, not from any dismissal, but from the particular quality of her stillness that meant she had returned to being a queen rather than a person asking questions. I walked back through the corridor with its 40-foot ceilings and breathing walls. The guards parted for me at the docking collar. Commander Lythe Four Winds was waiting on the other side, with a datapad full of forms he wanted me to sign, and a great many feelings about irregular diplomatic contact that he wished to express at length. I signed the forms. Back in my cabin on the Aurelian, my noodles were exactly where I had left them, cold and congealed in their container. I threw them away and made fresh ones. While they were heating, I opened a new research document and began writing the first notes on what I was already thinking of as the Velhari convergence mechanism. The activator design, the dormant cluster, the structural analog between human plague response genetics and 11,000-year-old insectoid avian evolutionary architecture. 17 ideas. That was the count by the time my noodles were done. I ate at my desk and kept writing, because there were patterns in the data that I had not finished noticing yet, and once you start noticing a pattern, stopping feels like a small kind of loss. Outside my window, the Velhari Royal Corvette undocked from the Aurelian and moved away into the dark between stars. I watched it go for about 30 seconds. Then I turned back to my screen. There was more to read.